All right, everybody. This week we are going to be working on assignment 4.1 critiques. And this was our small depth of field and large depth of field images. And just to review a couple things here, the large depth of field is, of course, everything that's in focus. And the small depth of field is where we have just a subject in focus and either the background or the foreground out of focus. And there's a couple ways we can achieve this. So first of all, we can achieve a small depth of field using a low aperture number. We can achieve a large depth of field using a high aperture number. So an example of that would be 22. We can also get a large depth of field by using a wide angle lens. And then conversely, a small depth of field by using a telephoto lens. And then last but not least, we can kind of simulate that telephoto lens or that wide angle lens by moving back, or closer. So with the small depth of field, we would move closer, simulating that telephoto lens. And then on the opposite end of the scale, with a large depth of field, we would be moving farther away from the subject. So with that being said, let's talk about your images here. And again, this is going to be a rather straightforward critique here this week because I'm really looking for technical execution more than anything. Of course, creativity is always appreciated, and certainly we'll talk about compositional elements, which, as you guys I'm sure have realized by now, with Module 5, that is what we're working on here. So first image, Janae, you've got a dandelion, and it is presumably a small depth of field. At least it looks that way to me, so we'll call it small depth of field, and successful there. But we go in and look at our aperture values, and we see our aperture value is 4.5, which is spot on the money. And then, we can go in and look at this and also see that you've gotten, it looks like, pretty close to this dandelion. And so by getting close and by using that low aperture number or low f-stop number, aperture and f-stop, remember, are interchangeable words here for our purposes. So that's spot on. Good job with that one. And I like the image. I think the background is kind of soft and out of focus, and it draws our attention to that very bright sort of textural quality of the seeded puffball of that dandelion here. So good job there. And then the same image, we can see it's clearly a large depth of field. Everything's in focus. It's good to point out that Janae has now moved back far away from the dandelion, so she's simulating that wide angle lens here. And I'm reasonably certain if we go in and look at her settings, yeah, absolutely, an f-stop of 16. So that is spot on there, and a good way to start us off here, Janae. So good work on that. And then next up, we have Timothy's work. And the first image looks like we've got a statue that is kind of embedded in some foliage here, and certainly looks like a small depth of field image. And if we go in, we take a look at your file info. So we don't see the file info there. So I'm just going to close this out a sec, and we'll take a look at your reflection document. And so in your reflection document here, we can see right away f-stop of 5.6. Thank you, Timothy. I appreciate you actually making a note of this information for me. And this is super helpful, especially when that information doesn't get embedded in our metadata that rides along with our photograph. So nice job on the small depth of field, and then large depth of field here. Just looking at it from the just normal perspective here, it's clear that this is a large depth of field image. So we could go in and take a look at his settings, but of course, for some reason they've gotten stripped out. But I can see that this is clearly a large depth of field image. The interesting thing here is I feel like in this image, the statue gets a little bit buried in all of this foliage, whereas this one we can see that that statue really jumps off the page at us. And this is really why we would use this technique here. So it kind of sorts out a really, really busy background by putting one thing in focus and allowing our eye to actually go to that thing and sort of fall on it. Because our eye is really seeking order, or I should say our brain is seeking order and seeking focus. So it's going to go to the things in photographs that are in focus, which in this case here, you've certainly nailed this. So good job here, Timothy. Couple good ones so far. And then next up we have Hannah's work. And Hannah's got the small depth of field image with the purple stuffed animal in focus and all of the other ones in the background out of focus. Really love how you've set up this beautiful diagonal line here, Hannah. But our eye clearly goes to the purple one here that's in focus. And I'd be willing to bet if we go in, we take a look at your settings, and there we go. We see that low f-stop or aperture value of 4.0. So nice job on that. And beautiful image. I like the way this is set up. And then the large depth of field, I'm going to bet that we've got a high f-stop number, which of course we do. And you know, the interesting thing here is, you know, while my eye in this photograph with the large depth of field goes to the purple animal in the foreground, I think it kind of like, it moves all the way through the frame and maybe ends up on this orange duck or this orange whatever this little stuffed creature is back there. So I think when we have the large depth of field here, and especially working with the diagonal line, our eye tends to be a little bit more active here and move through the frame. Whereas this one, I think our eye kind of sort of settles in on this purple one and kind of hangs out here and starts to digest what's going on here. So two photographs of essentially the same exact subject, but I think they're read by our brain very differently just by switching those f-stop settings in there. So super job here, Hannah. I really like the photo, and I really like how it kind of creates two very different moods by just changing these technical settings just a little bit. So nice job here. And then next up we have Maurice's work, and on our I'm sorry, that is Maurice. And on our large depth of field image, we've got focus that goes all the way from his wrist here through to the couple that looks like they're going hand in hand, to even the buildings in the background are in pretty decent focus. So we look at our file info here, and we see it's an f-stop of 14, so that is a high number. And when we're talking, you know, high and low f-stop numbers, you know, the high ones we would say anything probably 11 through 22, and the low ones would be 8 and below. So, you know, in this one we've seen a couple that large ones that were at 16. This one's at 14. Again, very clearly large depth of field. Perhaps, Maurice, maybe you consider moving this ISO up to 400, which would allow you to get an even higher aperture value, which is probably going to get the building in the background in just a little bit sharper focus here. But again, it not a big deal here. I think you've essentially captured the spirit of the assignment and what I'm looking for. And then your small depth of field image. Wow, what a difference. I mean, same exact subject matter, but a totally different look and feel that you've established in here by using that small depth of field. And of course, we've got an f-stop of 8, which, as I just said, f-stop 8, 5.6, 4, all of those are progressively going to give us a smaller and smaller depth of field. And also we notice you've moved, or you are very close to this flower, so that even exaggerates that that much more. So again, great job with this. I think everybody so far has really hit the mark and gets what I'm looking for. So far, so good. And then next up, we have Diodric's work. And you see we've got a small depth of field here on this image. And pine tree is, of course, out of focus there. And I'm certain if we go in and take a look at his file info, yep, we've got that low f-stop number, which is what I'm looking for. The background isn't super blurry, and one of the reasons for that is the background's kind of far away from the subject, and also you are sort of far away from the statue here. And so it's not quite as exaggerated as, say, maybe Maurice's image in the last one with the flower, where, he was probably like, maybe 6 to 10 inches away from that flower, whereas you're a fairly decent distance away. So that small depth of field isn't quite as exaggerated, but certainly the technique and what I'm looking for out of those aperture or f-stop values is right there. So nice job with that. And then your large depth of field image, and look at our settings. Whoa, what happened here? So we've got an f-stop of 5.6, which in this instance, we could really move this ISO up to 400, and we could probably drop this exposure maybe down to 1/250th or 1/125th, and that would allow us to move this f-stop value higher and higher. Now, you guys are probably all saying, well, everything is in focus in this photograph, and yeah, you're right. Everything is in pretty good focus here. What's happening is you've moved just really far away from the subject. So by moving far away from the subject, it kind of takes away the exaggerated effect of a small depth of field. So, you're kind of like hanging in the middle there. Again, I think the image that you provided us with is certainly, the background is not super blurry, especially when we don't zoom in here. But I think you could have worked with that aperture value and get that aperture value up just a little bit more, and this background would have been that much sharper, that much crisper. So, you're almost there. Visually, it's working, and I think actually, in many ways, this image appeals to me much more than the other image, because you've kind of got all this greenery that the statue sort of emerges from. But just that f-stop value is not where I need it to be here. So just one little hiccup in the whole thing here. But otherwise, really good job here. And I think again, at least conceptually, you understand what I'm looking for out of a large and small depth of field. And so next up, we have Matthew's images. And first image, very clearly a small depth of field. We've got the background and the pillows and sort of the lamp. All of that stuff is out of focus, and the little fall display here of flowers and simulated squash are in focus. So let's take a look at our information, and we've got an f-stop of 4.5. So you are on the mark here. So well done. I mean, it kind of feels like a little bit of a busy image, but I think my eye ultimately kind of goes to this squash like object in the foreground of the image. So, works really well, and the technique certainly reinforces that visual magnet that this thing becomes. And then our large depth of field, so clearly you've stepped back a little bit. So again, remember, if we step back from things, that's just naturally going to exaggerate either the small or large depth of field. So we've got a large depth of field here. And then let's go in and look at your settings. And we see in the settings here an f-stop of 22. And what I really like you did here, Matthew, is you very wisely increased your ISO up to 6400. And by doing so, that allowed you to bring this f-stop value up there. You're certainly pushing the edges of the quality of the image, because that ISO going all the way up to 6400 is going to give us, a little bit of noise here on our shot. And again, when I talk about noise, if you look at sort of like, it looks like this sort of grainy, pixely look to images, that is what I mean by noise. And that noise is going to become more and more apparent as we start to push that ISO value higher and higher in our images. So totally logical why you did it, and I'm actually very happy that you did it, because it shows me that you've got a really deep understanding of how that shutter aperture ISO relationship works, and how if you change one, then you can change the other to get the settings that you're going to need. And of course, you're always going to have to maybe make little sacrifices. So you kind of sacrificed image quality here, but in doing so, you got everything in focus, which was the essence of this assignment here. So nice job with this one, Matthew. And next up, we have D'Angelo's work. So we've got a small depth of field here. You have very clearly a small depth of field. This bottle in the foreground is in focus, while I don't know, what is the little plate or some sort of display piece, and the Hollywood icon is in the background, out of focus. And let's see what our file info looks like. We don't have that file info there, but we can clearly see this is very much a small depth of field in this image. But I do like the fact that you've gone ahead. I just pulled up your reflection here, and in the reflection you went ahead and gave us your settings, which is exactly what I'm looking for. So I'm very happy that you've done that, and we can see we've got the f-stop of 5.6. By the way, everybody, make sure you just proofread everything. Sometimes there's going to be words that spell check isn't going to catch, and I think you mean cologne here in this word. So even though spell check looks at your stuff, there's going to be things that it misses. So make sure you just give it a second reading and make sure all the words are correct. So good job with that one. And then our large depth of field, very much a large depth of field image. Everything's in focus, even going all the way back to even the outlets in the background. What I really like is, and again, we'll talk about this a lot in this week's module, is the use of line here. So we've sort of got these diagonal lines that really draw our eye through the whole photograph. And the way this is set up too is kind of, these are set up on a triangle, so our eye visually kind of works through the frame, from the cologne bottle all the way back to the plate, and same way on this end here. So nice job with this one, and again, a really good demonstration of how we can use that technique to create a very different look just by changing up our aperture values here. So nice work on this one, D'Angelo. And then next up we have Dominic's work. And so from the first image here, his small depth of field shot, we've got good old Pete Canisius, and you've gotten really tight in on his face, and the chapel in the background, presuming that's a chapel, yep, in the background there is somewhat out of focus. Although the one thing I have to say, Dominic, and perhaps this was intentional, maybe you wanted to get that crucifix up by his head, but it almost feels to me like it's almost an extension of the statue here, especially because the tonality of the background is very similar to the statue. But, very clearly a small depth of field image. And if we look at our settings, whoa. My veteran, Dominic, what are you doing here on your small depth of field? F-stop of 13. This is why we're seeing a little bit of this background blend in here. Now again, what's happened is you've moved in really close, so you've got either a telephoto lens. Did I look at that correctly? Let's see what lens you've got. Yeah, so you've got a 135 millimeter lens, which is a telephoto lens, which is definitely going to give us a small depth of field just by the very makeup of that lens. And then, of course, if you were to put a smaller f-stop or aperture value on this would have really even exaggerated that out of focus background that we're looking for here. So, I mean, you've got it, but you could have even exaggerated it that much more by using a lower f-stop value. And then your large depth of field image. And we've got an f-stop of 11, which is, pretty appropriate on that. Go back to this one. Okay, Dominic. So I've mentioned this a couple times to other people in the class, and again, just want to reinforce this to you. This is a beautiful photo. It is certainly an example of a large depth of field, but it was taken in the spring, which you had in your acknowledgement of the syllabus. You had read and acknowledged that for each assignment you were going to create new stuff. So in this instance, you did not create a new photograph for me. You were using your old photographs. So shame on you, Dominic. You should know better here. And while you totally got the large depth of field thing here, you get a little smack on the wrist for not going out and shooting new images. So please, everybody, let me reinforce this again. You need to create new images for each and every assignment. So please, next time, Dominic, let's go out and shoot some new stuff. All right, next up we have Sydney's work. And first image, small depth of field. Beautiful photograph. Love this image. And we've got the small little flowers in the foreground that are in focus, and the barn in the background out of focus. Look at your camera data, and you've got an f-stop of 5.6, which is right on the money. And again, we've got this low ISO value, which we've talked about noise previously, but you can see just how clean this image looks. Just going to zoom in here a little bit. You don't see any of that graininess to the image, especially sort of in the cleaner areas of the photograph, like the sky here. So again, just showing you guys the difference between these different ISOs. I know we're talking about depth of field here, but all of these things are intertwined, so it's good to take a look at things along the way. By the way, Sydney, this image looks a little bit on the blue side to me, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It really emphasizes that sky a lot. But I'm wondering if this image, if it was a little bit cooler. So I just put a yellow filter on there, which yellow is the opposite of blue. And you can see when I put that in there, you start to get the grass is a little bit greener. And this is something you can do in Camera Raw, just play around with your color balance there. And certainly it's more of a personal aesthetic taste thing here. I think the grass looks a little blue here, or it looks a little bit greener. But the sky in your original one just looks a little bit richer blue, whereas as this sky sort of takes on a little bit of that yellow. So again, just offering sort of different choices to you, not necessarily that there was anything wrong with your image at all, but just want you to always have choices and consider some other things. And then your large depth of field image. Go in, look at your file info. And of course here, similar thing that a few of you guys have done you're at an f-stop of 5.6, which normally would be associated with a small depth of field. But remember, there's the three things that are going to affect depth of field. That's our f-stop, and then either a wide or a telephoto lens, and how far you are away from the subject. So you're pretty far away from the subject here, and you're using a wide angle lens, 36 millimeters or 39 millimeters is sort of on the slight wide angle end of things here. So those two things are what is giving us that large depth of field. I think in this instance, you could have gone in and very simply gotten an f-stop of 11 just by dropping the shutter setting from 1/2000th down to 1/500th. That would have allowed the f-stop to go up to 2 stops to f11, and it probably would have made it just a teeny bit sharper in the background here, because I'd be willing to bet if we kind of zoom in on the trees here, there's a little bit soft, not horribly soft, but in a perfect world, and you've actually got some really beautiful, great conditions to shoot in here, so there's no reason you shouldn't be able to push that f-stop up higher towards 11 or 16. So yeah, I think you've got the spirit, the essence of the assignment, but you could have just done one extra step here that really would have sort of cemented that look of a large depth of field. So beautiful images, though, and I appreciate you taking the time to sort of get out of the city and get out of Canisius campus and show us some stuff out in the rural areas here. So good job with that. And the last one up in this critique here is Victoria's work. And we see Victoria's first image is a small depth of field. By the way, one quick thing here, Victoria, you uploaded this as a PSD, which basically is a Photoshop format document, which certainly is readable in Photoshop. But just, again, when you save your stuff, I prefer just for efficiency's sake here that we save them as JPEGs, because they're going to come through as smaller documents. So you see how I did save as there. And here's what you didn't do. You forgot to pull this Photoshop down to JPEG there. So just make sure you do that in the next assignments. I know it's a super easy thing to forget. I've done it myself, and completely understandable, but just want to remind you again to do that. So let's take a look at your settings here on your small depth of field. So you've got a couple things going on that are not ideal. So you had your flash go off for this assignment, which I would really strongly encourage everybody to avoid using their flash or their strobe in images, because it kind of flattens the scene out. Look, notice how it kind of almost has a visual feeling as like they're almost like cutouts. That is very much one of the things that's characteristic of using a flash. And again, this is outside, so I just wonder why you would even need to do that outside. So be aware of that. The other thing here is you've got a wide angle lens, and because you've got a wide angle lens, and again, remember what we've talked about here, it kind of cancels out the small depth of field effect here. So if you look at this, kind of everything looks like it's in focus. There's really not one area that our eye goes to in the photograph, which is kind of the idea of what having a small depth of field is in an image. I'm kind of scrolling around here, and geez, it looks like everything's in focus. So that's what happened here. Your wide angle lens, which that's 18 millimeters, is definitely wide angle, and that's the problem right there. So your f-stop is correct, and I could buy it with that f-stop, but the wide angle lens is what's canceling out your small depth of field here. And you know, when we're working with small depth of fields, and hopefully you've noticed in, you know, some of the other students' work, when you actually create like visual depth in a photograph. So, you know, you want to stack things up going backwards in a photograph. So there's actually something in the foreground and something in the background, that thing in the foreground can be in focus and the thing in the background is out of focus. It kind of feels like in this image, everything's in the foreground. There's really no background here because it's just dominated by the flowers and the leaves here. So unfortunately, that doesn't work so much for our small depth of field. On the other hand, large depth of field image, this totally works here. And let's take a look at your settings. You know, you notice your flash hasn't gone off in this photograph, but if you look what's happening here, your F is 3.1. That's really, really low. But what's happened here, and it's the same thing that happened in the other shot, you have an f-stop of, I'm sorry, not an f-stop, a lens of a 4mm lens or a 25mm lens in a wide angle lens. And in that case, it totally works here for you. So that is what's giving you the large depth of field in this image. And you know, we can see everything from the brick in the foreground all the way to the brick in the background is in focus. Now, what I probably would have done in this scenario, you know, going back to your small depth of field and, you know, seeing where you are at, maybe taking like one of these flower buds that were falling off the plant in the foreground and shoot that, having, you know, established some depth. So you kind of go eye level. You would have to sort of squat down here right along the concrete. And then that way you would have had a little bit more depth in your background. And then you probably would have seen at least a little bit more depth in the small depth of field image. So hopefully that makes sense to you what I'm saying here. And again, just a reminder to all, please make sure you keep your flash off in the images. And again here, Victoria, it was a daylight situation. I'm assuming both these were shot at a similar time. And if that's the case, I just don't see why we would have any need for a flash here. So keep that in mind as you're working through your next assignment. And to all of you, you know, good job with this. I think across the board, it seems like everybody has a good general understanding of the settings that I'm looking for here. Of course, this is a very technical exercise, so, you know, I understand that maybe you're not pushing the envelope in terms of creativity, but certainly we want to begin to think about that moving along and try to you know, push the envelope a little bit when it comes to thinking of new creative things to photograph. Victoria, I don't want to pick on you, or Dominic, don't want to pick on you, or anybody else that sort of did the obvious things in the quad. You know, maybe try to capture something that is less obvious, that we wouldn't generally notice as we kind of are, you know, just walking from point A to point B in the quad. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in our modules coming up, where we start to push the creative envelope. But from a technical point of view, I think everybody's where they need to be right now. And hopefully things are starting to fall in place in terms of understanding how to control the exposure in your camera and what those controls are going to do to the overall look of your image. So look forward to seeing you guys next week, or seeing your images next week. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please don't be shy. Give me a buzz or shoot me an email, and we'll get things worked out. So have a good weekend.